Do you remember those strange 1940s items, the ones you will not find in grocery stores today? In the 1940s, they lined shelves during rationing, shaping how families cooked, stretched meals, and survived. What do their disappearances say about how much life and food has changed? Powdered eggs were one of the most common and strange staples of the 1940s, sold in tins or cardboard boxes as a substitute for fresh eggs. With real eggs sent overseas to soldiers or rationed down to almost nothing, families had to find a way to keep breakfast on the table. Enter powdered eggs, which looked like pale yellow dust and were meant to be whisked with water until they resembled the texture of a cracked egg. They did not taste the same, of course, and many people remembered the chalky flavor with a wince. Still, the government promoted them heavily, assuring homemakers that they could scramble, bake, and cook with them, almost as if nothing had changed. Families learned to make do, folding them into cakes, stirring them into batters, or bulking them up with milk and herbs to hide the flavor. Kids knew the difference, but hunger made them eat anyway. These tins became as common in pantries as flour and sugar, proving how much rationing shaped daily life. Today, it is nearly impossible to find powdered eggs on grocery shelves, but in the 1940s, they were a lifeline. Wartime margarine with dye packets was another peculiar grocery item and one that confused children at the time. Because butter was so scarce and so prized, margarine became the everyday alternative, but it originally came in a stark white block. To make it resemble butter, companies included a tiny packet of yellow dye that homemakers had to knead through the margarine by hand. Some even recalled their children begging to help, squeezing the bag until the dye spread unevenly, leaving streaks of gold in the white. It was messy, tedious, and hardly appetizing, but it did the job of tricking the eye. Advertisements even promoted this ritual as fun for the family, though most parents rolled their eyes. It was a reminder that substitutes were the new normal, and appearances mattered more than taste. After the war, margarine finally became pre-colored, and few looked back fondly on those dye packets. Still, the memory remains one of the strangest details of wartime grocery shopping. Mock banana extract was a curious invention that speaks volumes about shortages in the 1940s. With imported bananas cut off during the war, Americans had to say goodbye to their favorite tropical fruit. But clever chemists came up with a substitute, flavoring made from plants like fig or banana squash, bottled and sold as mock banana extract. It was meant for baking, so pies, cakes, and puddings could still carry a hint of banana taste, even if no bananas were in sight. The flavor was strange, sharp, and not quite right, but for families desperate to hold on to familiar recipes, it became a fixture in pantries. Homemakers swapped tips on how to blend it with sugar or vanilla to mask the odd aftertaste. Children who grew up with it often said it tasted fake once they finally had a real banana again. Still, in its moment, it was a small miracle, something to bridge the gap between loss and normalcy. Today, the idea of fake banana made from fig extract sounds odd, but back then, it was a strange solution to a very real problem. Soy Victory sausage was one of the strangest meats to line shelves during the 1940s. With real meat in short supply, companies blended soy flour, fillers, and scraps into sausages that were meant to stretch rations further. These sausages often looked the part, but once cooked, they revealed their odd texture and flavor. Many described them as rubbery or bland, but they were cheap and filling, and that mattered more than taste. The government promoted them as patriotic, urging families to embrace soy as a way to help win the war. Cookbooks included recipes that added onions, breadcrumbs, or herbs to improve the flavor. Families learned to slice them into casseroles or stews where the strangeness could be hidden. For many, it was their first real exposure to soy as food, and it stuck in memory as both peculiar and necessary. Soy sausages never became a beloved staple, but they were a symbol of sacrifice at the dinner table. Victory coffee substitute was a bitter reminder of shortages made from roasted chicory root, barley, or other grains. Real coffee beans were scarce, and Americans had to accept that their morning cup would not taste the same. Grocery shelves stocked jars of this substitute, advertised as rich and satisfying, though few agreed. Some ads even claimed it was healthier than coffee, boasting that it was easy on the nerves and ideal for families. Homemakers were encouraged to brew it proudly, as though drinking it was a patriotic duty. For many, it became less about taste and more about keeping up a comforting ritual. Many said it tasted burnt or earthy, with none of the warmth that real coffee provided. Still, it gave people something hot to drink, and the ritual mattered more than the taste. Families drank it with milk or sweetened it with precious sugar to mask the bitterness. Some soldiers overseas grew used to it and drank it even after the war, but most abandoned it the moment real coffee returned. Victory coffee substitutes were strange, unwelcome, and unforgettable, tied forever to the sacrifices of the 1940s. Powdered gelatin desserts in odd flavors became another strange feature of the wartime pantry. While fruit-flavored gelatin had long been popular, the 1940s introduced savory flavors like tomato, celery, or even chicken. These powders were marketed as creative ways to stretch meals, turning leftovers into molded salads or aspics. Government pamphlets even included recipes for gelatin meat salads, showing off peas, carrots, and even hot dogs floating in wobbly shapes. Magazines praised them as thrifty, modern, and attractive, though many families quietly dreaded serving them. Children in particular were baffled, expecting dessert but finding vegetables inside. Homemakers were encouraged to suspend vegetables, meat scraps, or even fish inside jiggling blocks of gelatin, creating bizarre dishes that baffled children and guests alike. The idea was efficiency, nothing wasted, everything served. Cookbooks filled with recipes for salads that combined gelatin with mayonnaise, peas, and carrots, insisting they were both nutritious and elegant. In truth, they were strange, often unappetizing, and today they are remembered mostly as culinary curiosities. Few recipes from this gelatin craze survived beyond the wartime years, but the memory of tomato-flavored gelatin lingers as one of the oddest items ever sold in grocery stores. Canned horsemeat stew was one of the most controversial and strange protein sources of the 1940s. Beef was in short supply, but horses were plentiful, and some companies began quietly selling canned horsemeat as stew. For many, the very idea was unsettling, but wartime hunger softened resistance. Ads framed it as a noble choice, with slogans like, "Every bite helps the fight," trying to make eating horse feel patriotic. In some areas, butchers openly sold horse cuts, though they were labeled carefully to avoid scaring buyers. Those who ate it often avoided telling neighbors, embarrassed by the stigma. Ads promoted it as affordable, hearty, and patriotic, encouraging families to see it as just another type of meat. In truth, it was stringy, tough, and carried a flavor most Americans did not embrace. Yet in some areas, especially on the West Coast, canned horse meat found a market. Families who tried it rarely admitted it, but the tins sold steadily enough to be remembered. Once the war ended and beef returned to shelves, horse meat vanished almost overnight. It remains one of the strangest chapters in American grocery history. Dehydrated soup bricks were another strange but practical item from wartime grocery stores. These compressed cubes or rectangles contained dried vegetables, bouillon, and grains, ready to be boiled into soup. They were promoted as a miracle of convenience. Just drop one into water and dinner was served. Some even came with patriotic names like Victory Soup, promising both comfort and efficiency. Community cookbooks suggested adding scraps of onion, potatoes, or cabbage to make the broth heartier. For many families, these bricks became a way to turn almost nothing into something that could feed a crowd. The texture and taste were far from gourmet, but families welcomed the ease. They often added scraps of meat, potatoes, or garden vegetables to bulk up the meal. Children remembered the bricks dissolving into murky broth with an odd smell, but it was warm and filling. For soldiers and civilians alike, they became a familiar staple. Today we have instant soup powders and packaged mixes, but the old bricks feel almost medieval. They were practical, strange, and a symbol of a world learning to stretch every resource. Canned tripe was another 1940s grocery item that feels unusual today. Tripe, the stomach lining of cows, was inexpensive and high in protein, making it a wartime staple. Canned versions appeared on shelves, marketed as ready-to-cook or pre-cooked convenience meals. Some recipes suggested frying it with onions or stewing it with tomatoes, trying to make the chewy texture more appealing. Immigrant families who were already familiar with tripe often embraced it, but for others, it was a jarring new addition to the dinner table. Advertisers tried to market it as hearty and wholesome, but no slogan could make it popular with kids. Ads promoted it as traditional, nutritious, and thrifty, even though many Americans had never eaten it before. Recipes for tripe stew or fried tripe appeared in community cookbooks, showing how homemakers adapted to make it palatable. The texture was chewy and the flavor polarizing, but families learned to live with it. Some immigrant communities already enjoyed tripe, but for many others, it became a strange necessity of the times. Once the war ended, canned tripe quickly disappeared, leaving behind memories of one of the most unusual proteins of the decade. Soy Victory bread was yet another patriotic twist on grocery shopping in the 1940s. With wheat rationed and demand high, bakers added soy flour to bread dough to stretch supplies. It was promoted as healthier, more nutritious, and part of the war effort. Posters proudly declared, "Eat soy bread, save wheat for the front," tying every slice directly to the fight overseas. Some homemakers swore by its denser texture, but many admitted that the flavor was heavy and unappealing. Children often complained that it was nothing like the soft white loaves they had grown up with. Loaves looked familiar, but the taste was slightly off, described as heavier and denser than regular bread. Ads told families that eating Victory bread was a way to help win the war, making every slice feel symbolic. Homemakers served it proudly, even as children turned up their noses. For some, it was their first encounter with soy as a staple ingredient. Once the war ended, soy bread faded from shelves, replaced by the fluffy white loaves people had missed. Victory bread is remembered today as both strange and deeply tied to the sacrifices of the 1940s. Dried milk tablets were one of the strangest ways families in the 1940s tried to get their nutrition. Fresh milk was difficult to keep and often reserved for children or soldiers, so companies offered a substitute: milk that had been dehydrated and pressed into chalky little tablets. They were sold in tins or small cardboard boxes, marketed as convenient, portable nutrition for the whole family. Parents were told they could pack them in lunch boxes or carry them on the go as a source of protein and vitamins. The reality was less appealing. The tablets were hard, crumbly, and left a dry film on the tongue. Many children hated the taste, but with so few options, they had little choice but to choke them down. Cookbooks sometimes recommended crushing the tablets into water to make a makeshift milk drink, though the flavor was bitter and strange. Despite all this, the government and food companies promoted them as modern science at work, a way to ensure no one went without milk entirely. After the war, these tablets disappeared quickly, remembered mostly as a wartime compromise no one was eager to relive. Canned liver spread was another common but unusual sight in the 1940s grocery stores. With premium cuts of meat heavily rationed, organ meats became a more affordable option. Liver was inexpensive, full of iron, and easy to process into a spreadable paste that could be packaged in tins. Ads promoted it as a budget-friendly sandwich filler, perfect for school lunches or quick family meals. Some homemakers served it on crackers or toast to make it seem more appetizing, but the strong flavor was hard to disguise. Recipes often suggested mixing it with mustard or onions to mask the taste. For immigrant families who were already familiar with liver, the product was more welcome, but many Americans found it a stretch. Children especially turned up their noses at the metallic flavor, but hunger often won out over preference. After the war, canned liver spread stuck around in some markets but gradually faded from mainstream shelves, remembered as one of the stranger and less loved protein options of the decade. Sardine and egg paste sounds odd today, but in the 1940s it was marketed as a cheap, high-protein spread. Sold in small tins, it was a mixture of mashed sardines blended with hard-boiled eggs, oil, and seasoning. The result was a pungent, salty paste meant to be spread on bread or crackers. Wartime advertisements promoted it as nutritious, affordable, and patriotic, a way to get both protein and vitamins in a single bite. Families used it in sandwiches or served it at community suppers when meat was hard to come by. The smell was unmistakable, and many children dreaded it appearing in their lunchboxes. Still, it filled stomachs and stretched rations further, which was what mattered most. In some coastal areas, sardine-based products were more common and accepted, but inland, many people found the flavor overwhelming. Once rationing ended, sardine and egg paste quickly fell out of favor, leaving behind memories of one of the most peculiar spreads ever sold in American grocery stores. Spam variants like spiced ham loaf filled shelves in the 1940s, turning a simple canned meat into an entire category of strange products. Spam itself was already a staple, beloved by soldiers and civilians for its long shelf life and versatility. But as demand grew, companies introduced flavored versions that were meant to add variety: garlic, spiced, or even ham and cheese loaves. Many of these were heavily processed, with textures and flavors that did not always hit the mark. Families used them in casseroles, sandwiches, and stews, doing their best to stretch the meat across multiple meals. Some homemakers swore by certain flavors, while others joked that they all tasted the same. The affordability and availability made these variants popular despite their oddness, and entire cookbooks were written around ways to use them creatively. After the war, Spam stuck around, but most of the stranger variants slowly disappeared, remembered more as wartime experiments than lasting favorites. Powdered lemonade mix with no real lemon was another strange wartime grocery item. Citrus imports were scarce, so companies filled the gap with artificially flavored powders that promised a refreshing tart drink. Families would dissolve the powder in water, often adding sugar to make it more palatable. The result was a pale imitation of real lemonade, but for children, it was still a sweet treat. Advertisements sold it as modern and convenient, part of the new wave of food science that made everyday life easier. Some homemakers even used the powder in baking, sneaking it into cakes or pies as a citrus substitute. Still, the flavor was artificial, and those who grew up with it often recalled it tasting chemical compared to fresh fruit. After the war, real lemons returned to the market, and powdered lemonade mixes lost their place. They remain a reminder of how far companies went to fill gaps on shelves during rationing. Canned ox tongue was a delicacy-turned-budget option that became strangely normalized in the 1940s. Ox tongue had long been considered a specialty dish in some European cuisines, but wartime shortages made it a more practical protein source in America. Canned versions appeared in grocery stores, promising convenience and affordability. Some advertisements even tried to disguise the cut by calling it beef tongue loaf, making it sound less intimidating. In households, it was often sliced thin and arranged carefully on platters so guests might not notice what they were eating. Community cookbooks even suggested serving it cold with pickles or mustard to make it feel like a luxury. Advertisements suggested slicing it thin for sandwiches or serving it cold on platters. While the flavor was rich and the meat surprisingly tender, many Americans struggled with the idea of eating tongue. Still, it was cheaper than prime cuts and available when beef was scarce, so families gave it a try. Some children grew up thinking it was normal until later realizing what they had eaten. Once rationing ended, canned ox tongue faded from mainstream grocery stores, but its memory lingers as one of the strangest meats to ever sit on American shelves. Canned rabbit became a more common grocery item in the 1940s as rationing forced families to look beyond traditional meats. Rabbit had long been eaten in rural areas, but urban families were less familiar with it. Canned rabbit stew was promoted as an affordable, hearty option that fit into wartime meal plans. Government pamphlets even suggested rabbit as the chicken of the garden, trying to make it sound familiar to wary buyers. In cities, many people felt uneasy about eating what they thought of as pets, but hunger often pushed those concerns aside. Companies framed rabbit as patriotic, insisting that eating it was another way to support the troops. Ads described it as tender and flavorful, though many found it gamey compared to beef or chicken. Families who raised rabbits at home sometimes canned their own, making the grocery version feel practical. Recipes suggested pairing it with vegetables or serving it over noodles to stretch it further. For some, canned rabbit was a welcome alternative. For others, it was a last resort. Once beef and poultry returned to shelves, rabbit quickly lost its place, remembered as a curious but short-lived wartime food. Canned codfish cakes were another example of seafood being turned into a shelf-stable protein. These were patties of ground cod mixed with fillers like potato, flour, and spices, packed into tins for easy storage. To serve them, homemakers would fry or bake the patties, often topping them with sauce to mask the bland flavor. Some advertisements bragged that codfish cakes were as easy as toast, highlighting their convenience in the kitchen. Magazines promoted them as a quick dinner for busy families, especially when paired with canned peas or carrots. In fishing regions of New England, they were embraced more readily, but inland families often found them strange and overly salty. Advertisements boasted of their convenience and nutrition, portraying them as a family-friendly dinner option. Some regions embraced them more readily, particularly in areas with fishing traditions, but for others, the taste and texture were an acquired one. Kids often complained about their fishy smell, but they were filling and inexpensive. Once fresh seafood became more available after the war, canned codfish cakes lost their appeal. They remain one of the more unusual canned goods of the 1940s, a reminder of how far families had to stretch their meals. Vegetable Victory Loaf Mix was a powdered product designed to be baked into a meat substitute. Made of beans, grains, and fillers, it was promoted as nutritious, patriotic, and thrifty. Ads encouraged homemakers to bake it in a loaf pan and serve it like meatloaf, slicing it for dinner alongside vegetables or gravy. Government campaigns described it as victory on a plate, encouraging families to eat proudly, even if meat was missing. Some homemakers tried to disguise the loaf by covering it in ketchup or gravy, hoping children would not notice the difference. At church suppers and community gatherings, it became a symbol of sacrifice and ingenuity, though no one pretended it was delicious. Families were told it was a way to do their part for the war effort, saving meat for soldiers. The texture was dense and the flavor was plain, leading many to add onions, herbs, or ketchup to improve it. For children, it often felt like punishment food, a reminder of what was missing. Still, it was cheap, filling, and easy to make, which gave it a place on many dinner tables. After the war, it quickly disappeared from shelves, remembered as one of the more forgettable victory foods of the decade. Chicory-based chocolate substitute may be one of the strangest sweets of the 1940s. With cocoa imports disrupted, companies experimented with chicory root, roasting and sweetening it to create something that vaguely resembled chocolate. Bars and powders made from it appeared on shelves, advertised as modern and patriotic. Advertisements told families it was just as sweet, though few children agreed once they tasted it. Housewives used it in cakes and brownies, but recipes often advised doubling the sugar to make up for its bitterness. Some families even joked that it was chocolate only in name, since it had none of the joy of the real thing. Children eagerly tried them, only to discover the flavor was bitter and earthy, nothing like real chocolate. Some homemakers used it in baking, hoping sugar and butter would mask the odd taste. Still, for families desperate for a treat, it was better than nothing. Once cocoa returned to the market, chicory chocolate vanished almost immediately, with few mourning its loss. Today, it is remembered mostly as a curiosity, proof of how inventive and strange wartime substitutes could be. Gelatin-based meat mold kits were one of the strangest products to ever appear in grocery stores of the 1940s. These packaged mixes came with gelatin powder and instructions that encouraged homemakers to suspend scraps of leftover meat, vegetables, or even fish inside quivering blocks of jelly. The result was a glossy, colorful dish that was supposed to look elegant on the dinner table, but more often than not, it just looked bizarre. Cookbooks of the era promoted these molds as thrifty and modern, telling women that they could impress dinner guests while saving money at the same time. The kits often included savory flavors like celery or chicken to help the gelatin blend more naturally with the meats inside, though few families would call the results appetizing. Kids especially were horrified by the texture. Cold beef cubes or canned tuna floating in wobbly jelly did not exactly scream comfort food. Still, The government and advertisers insisted that homemakers do their part by stretching every ounce of protein, and gelatin molds became one way of doing it. Housewives shared recipes at community events, often competing to see whose creation looked the most decorative, though taste rarely came first. These dishes were symbolic of the era's resourcefulness, but they also highlight how far people were willing to go to follow rationing rules. Once the war ended, meat mold kits quickly faded from memory, living on only in vintage cookbooks and the occasional retro photo that makes modern audiences shudder. They remain one of the clearest examples of how wartime necessity created culinary oddities that no one wanted to carry forward. Canned dandelion greens were another oddity of the 1940s that shows how far rationing pushed people into embracing foods once considered weeds. Dandelions had long been foraged by rural families, used in salads, teas, or sautéed as a cheap source of nutrition. But during the war, companies began packaging and selling canned versions of these greens, marketing them as super nutritious wartime vegetables. Advertisements claimed they were rich in iron, vitamins, and fiber, making them a patriotic choice for families trying to stay healthy while meat and fresh produce were scarce. The canned version, however, often had a bitter, mushy texture that turned off many first-time buyers. Homemakers tried to mask the taste with vinegar, butter, or bacon drippings, but children in particular resisted them. Despite this, the greens developed a reputation as a survival food, one more reminder that nothing edible should go to waste. Victory garden guides even encouraged families to grow dandelions intentionally, blurring the line between weeds and vegetables. The canned versions disappeared quickly after the war, when fresh produce was more available and appealing options returned to grocery stores. But for those who lived through the 1940s, the sight of canned dandelion greens remains a memory of tough times and tough choices. Nutrition first, flavor second. Victory garden canning kits became household essentials during the 1940s when the government urged families to grow and preserve their own food. With imports disrupted and rationing cutting into daily supplies, gardens were promoted as patriotic acts of service. The kits sold in grocery stores usually included glass jars, sealing lids, labels, and instructions, making it easier for families with little experience to start canning. Homemakers were told that every jar of beans, tomatoes, or peaches they preserved was a direct contribution to the war effort, freeing up food for soldiers overseas. Communities even held canning demonstrations, teaching people how to safely preserve vegetables without waste. For children, the sight of shelves lined with jars of preserved food became a symbol of security, a colorful display of survival. These kits were not glamorous, but they were practical, and families relied on them heavily. The process was time-consuming and sometimes dangerous, with the risk of jars shattering or food spoiling if not done correctly. Still, the sense of pride in filling a pantry with home-canned goods was powerful. After the war, canning kits remained available, but their importance dwindled as grocery stores once again filled with fresh and processed options. Today, vintage canning jars are prized as collectibles, but in the 1940s, they were part of a patriotic ritual that every household was expected to follow. Molasses in jars was another strange yet essential staple of 1940s grocery shopping, promoted as both sweetener and nutritional powerhouse. With sugar heavily rationed, families turned to alternatives, and molasses became one of the most important. Ads described it as rich in iron and vitamins, encouraging mothers to use it not just in baking, but as a spread on bread or stirred into milk. Its strong, bittersweet flavor was polarizing, but many households learned to adapt to it. Molasses cookies, gingerbread, and baked beans became common wartime recipes, using the syrupy ingredient to replace scarce sugar. Children often balked at its intense taste, but adults appreciated its versatility and availability. For some families, molasses became a symbol of resourcefulness, stretching across meals in ways that sugar never could. It was affordable, easy to store, and widely promoted as patriotic, making it a familiar jar in nearly every kitchen. After the war, sugar returned to shelves and molasses lost some of its appeal, though it remained tied to traditional recipes. Today, molasses is mostly associated with baking, but in the 1940s, It was a sweetener, a nutrient, and a reminder of how families made do with what they had. Karo corn syrup as a sugar substitute was one of the most heavily marketed products of the 1940s, advertised as a one-to-one replacement for scarce sugar. Grocery stores kept it prominently displayed, and ads showed smiling homemakers pouring the thick syrup into pies, cakes, and drinks as though nothing was missing. The message was clear. Corn syrup could fill the gap and keep desserts on the table. It was cheap, plentiful, and versatile, making it an easy sell during rationing. Families used it in everything from lemonade to fudge, though the flavor was noticeably different from sugar. Cookbooks of the era featured entire sections dedicated to recipes with corn syrup, emphasizing its patriotic value. Children grew up remembering its sticky texture and overly sweet taste, sometimes poured over pancakes or biscuits just to replace jam or honey. For many, it became a love-it or hate-it ingredient, tied directly to the memory of rationing. After the war, sugar returned and Karo syrup lost its status as a staple, though it never disappeared completely. Even today it lingers in recipes like pecan pie, a nostalgic holdover from its 1940s heyday. But in its prime, Karo corn syrup was more than just sweetener. It was a symbol of wartime adaptation, a sticky stand-in that families learned to depend on. Canned Vienna sausages were never about taste. They were about having anything on the shelf when everything else was gone. They came in small cans, floating in mystery liquid, and were eaten with crackers, straight from the tin or sliced into beans or rice. Used to be 50 cents a can. Now they are well over $1 and shrinking. You open the can and wonder where the rest of them went. Vienna sausages were poor people food, survival food, end of the month, no shame, full stomach food. Now they cost enough to make you hesitate, and that hesitation says everything. You do not buy them because they taste good. You buy them because they keep you fed, but even that small comfort now comes with sticker shock. If you saw one of these leaning against a kid's garage, you knew they were living a different life. The Sears 10-speed free Spirit was not just a bicycle, it was an upgrade. Taller, sleeker, and built for long rides, this thing looked like it came with a training manual. And unlike your single-speed hand-me-down, this had gears. 10 of them. That meant you could coast up hills while everyone else was walking theirs to the top. But bikes like this did not come cheap. They were department store royalty. Rich kids got them for birthdays, milestones, or just because. The paint never chipped, the chain never squeaked, and the kid riding it always looked like they had somewhere important to be, even if they were just circling the cul-de-sac. And when they pulled up to school, they parked them like prized possessions. You did not dare lean your bike next to theirs. It just looked wrong. These bikes were made for smooth roads, summer wind, and families who had extra room in the garage. You could hear the click of the shifters from a mile away, and every click reminded you that some kids were already going places, even if it was just around the block. Dry egg noodles in cellophane bags were the unsung hero of the pantry. You could get a whole bag for less than $1, and they could turn into just about anything. They boiled fast, held sauce well, and didn't need anything but a little margarine and salt to be considered dinner. If you had canned soup, they went in. If you had leftover meat, they soaked it up. They were soft, simple, and endlessly forgiving. You didn't read recipes, you cooked by feel, by habit, by hunger, and somehow those plain old noodles came out just right. They were the background singer in 100 family dinners. You could stretch them over multiple nights, or serve them all at once when company came by. Sometimes you buttered them with pepper and called it done. Other times you baked them into casseroles that fed a crowd. They were bland, yes, but also blank, ready for anything. No one praised the noodles, but no one left the table hungry. In the 1970s, this was your food safety net, cheap, filling, and flexible. Dry egg noodles were not a luxury, but they were a lifeline. Walking into the record store felt like entering a different world. Rows and rows of cardboard sleeves, each one a doorway to a sound, a feeling, a moment you had not lived yet, but already knew you needed. The air smelled like plastic and paper and possibility. You flipped through bins with your fingertips, letting the covers speak to you. Bowie, Stevie Wonder, the Eagles. Some names you knew, some you pretended to. Each trip was a treasure hunt. In the 1970s, teenagers did not just listen to music. They discovered it, held it, studied the liner notes like sacred text. Your favorite albums were not just things you played. They were pieces of you. You brought them home, unwrapped them like a gift, and dropped the needle with reverence. You waited for that first crackle before the sound poured out. Sometimes you listened with friends, sometimes alone, lights off, staring at the ceiling, letting the music say everything you could not. Saving up to buy a new record meant making choices, passing on candy, skipping a movie, maybe even mowing a few lawns. But it was always worth it, because what you got was more than sound. It was identity, it was escape, and it was yours. Canned pork and beans were everywhere in poor households. Whether dumped into a saucepan and served hot, eaten cold straight from the can, or spread over toast, they were one of the cheapest and most reliable sources of protein on the shelves. The beans were soft, the sauce sweet, and the little bits of pork more symbolic than substantial. Sometimes the pork was nothing more than a cube of fat floating on top, which kids treated like a prize or a joke, depending on who found it. The smell of beans simmering on the stove was so common that it became part of the background of weeknight dinners. Every kitchen seemed to have a pyramid of cans stacked in the pantry, waiting for their turn. Kids often joked about trying to find the tiny square of fat that counted as the pork. Sometimes it was a win if you spotted it. Other times it felt like the can had cheated you. Still, nobody cared because the beans themselves were hearty and satisfying, especially when paired with cornbread or rice. Parents bought cases of them because they lasted forever in the pantry and could be stretched into a meal in minutes. They might have been humble, but they were filling, and that made them unforgettable. These things were loud, literally and figuratively. Custom name belt buckles became a full-blown trend in the 1970s, and if your name was shining in metal across your waist, you were automatically cooler. They were chunky, shiny, and spelled out exactly who you were. And trust me, only certain kids wore them. The ones whose parents took them to the mall and said, "Pick anything you want." These buckles were not just about fashion. They were about identity. In a time before social media, this was your personal brand, worn right at the center of your body. You would walk into school and bam, there it was. Tony, Michelle, Jason, like a name tag that you had to earn. It said, "I matter." It said, "Look at me." And more than anything, it said, "I am not afraid to shine." Most of us could not afford them. Maybe you had a plain belt. Maybe you had no belt at all. But the kids with custom buckles, they made sure you saw them. They would tug their shirts up just enough, stand with hands on hips, or lean against lockers so that metal gleamed in the hallway light. It was all for show, and it worked. Off-brand soda in 2-liter bottles was the ultimate loophole. It tasted close enough, fizzed just fine, and cost a fraction of the name brands. For birthday parties, barbecues, and lunchroom trades, those big, bold-colored bottles were a lifesaver. Cola, orange, grape, take your pick. You could buy 4 for the price of 1 Coke and no one really complained. Now those same 2-liter off-brand sodas are over $1, sometimes close to $2. And the name brand versions? Practically luxury items. Suddenly generic is not so generic in price anymore. The shrinkflation is real too. Less fizz, smaller necks, faster staleness. And yet the price keeps rising, like we are all pretending these bottles were always worth that much. It used to be a safe grab at the checkout line. Toss in a bottle, no guilt, no stress. Now you catch yourself calculating how many cups you will actually get out of it. Off-brand soda, once made cheap, feel cheerful. Now it is just another product that forgot why people loved it in the first place. It still sits on the bottom shelf, but not quite as proudly. Canned chicken or turkey, store brand of course, was not about flavor. It was about feeding your family fast and cheap. You opened the can and got a mound of shredded meat floating in mystery broth. You drained it, fluffed it with a fork, and hoped the salt and spices would do the rest. It was perfect for sandwiches, casseroles, and anything involving cream of something soup. It did not taste like fresh meat, but it didn't need to. It was meat, and that was enough. You could stretch one can across an entire pot of noodles, and nobody complained. It made a good filling for pot pie when the freezer had nothing else to offer. You might mix in mayo and onions or eat it plain on toast if it was one of those weeks. It wasn't juicy, it wasn't tender, but it was protein, and it mattered. Some folks turned their nose up at it, but most kept a few cans in the back of the cupboard. It might not have had flavor, but it had purpose. In the 1970s, meat was a luxury, and canned versions were a compromise that kept dinner from falling apart. You could mix it with noodles, rice, or even top it on saltines when you were short on bread. It came through when nothing else did. No one raved about it, but they were always glad it was there. Canned poultry may have been humble, but it filled plates, filled sandwiches, and filled that space in the cupboard labeled just in case. Before binge-watching existed, before algorithms decided what you liked, there was one show that made everything feel okay. Happy Days. It came on just when you needed it, after a long day of school, after too much homework, after you had just been grounded for coming home late. You would sink into the couch, maybe with a bowl of cereal or a soda, and there they were, Richie, Potsy, and the Fonz. A crew of characters living in a cleaner, simpler version of the 1950s. One that somehow made the 1970s feel just a little less chaotic. You knew every catchphrase. You knew exactly when the laugh track would kick in. And when Fonzie hit the jukebox and it actually worked, you believed it could work for you too. Happy Days was more than a TV show. It was comfort, familiar, warm, a place where the problems always got solved in 30 minutes or less. And for a teenager trying to figure life out, that was a miracle. Looking back, it was kind of genius. A nostalgic show about the past that became a core memory of the present. For 1/2 hour, everything was cool, everything was all right, and everything felt like it was going to be just fine. Powdered drink mixes in recycled jars were another staple of poor kitchens. Kool-Aid, Tang, and the cheaper off-brand packets were mixed into old pickle jars or mayonnaise jars, usually with a handwritten label taped to the side. Mothers would dump in the powder, stir it with sugar, and store it in the fridge to save time later. The faint smell of vinegar often lingered in those jars, so your fruit punch sometimes carried a tang that did not belong. Kids gulped it down anyway, because sweet drinks were a treat no matter what. When guests came over, pitchers on the table were rarely new. They were jars that once held pickles, pasta sauce, or peanut butter. Nothing was wasted, and every container found a second life. The bright red or orange liquid inside was enough to make a poor kid feel like royalty, even if it was little more than sugar water. In the 1970s, recycled jars filled with cheap drink mix were the closest most families got to luxury beverages, and everyone remembered them with a mix of fondness and a laugh. Bulk rice in paper sacks was a staple that never ran out. You bought it in big brown bags, plain, no pictures, just a weight and a price. It sat in the pantry like a promise, always there when the fridge looked bare. You measured it by the cup, cooked it in a dented pot, and served it under just about everything. When there was meat, rice stretched it. When there was no meat, rice was enough. You rinsed it in a strainer that was slightly bent, watching cloudy water swirl down the sink. Sometimes it bubbled over and made a mess, but no one got mad. It meant dinner was almost ready. You learned to measure it without thinking. 1 part rice to 2 parts water, just like Mom said. Leftovers went into the fridge in stained plastic containers, ready for another meal tomorrow. Sometimes it was fried with onions and eggs, sometimes just reheated with a splash of broth. It was plain, but never boring. Not when you were hungry. Rice didn't ask for much, and it gave back everything. Sometimes it stuck to the bottom of the pan. Sometimes it came out perfect. Either way, you ate it. It was cheap, filling, and impossible to ruin beyond saving. With a little margarine and salt, it tasted like comfort. You could make a whole meal out of it if you had to. Rice with beans, rice with canned gravy, rice with whatever leftovers were still good. You did not think of it as poor food. You thought of it as normal. The bag might tear if it sat too long, so you kept it clipped shut with a clothespin, because every grain counted. In the 1970s, bulk rice was not a trend. It was survival wrapped in brown paper. These were not just toys. They were explosions with permission slips. Model rocket launch sets in the 1970s were the holy grail of cool. You got a tube, some fins, a nose cone, and most importantly, a real engine. You could build it, paint it, and watch it launch hundreds of feet into the sky. But they were not cheap, and they were not sold just anywhere. You needed adult supervision, wide open spaces, and money for replacement engines. That meant most kids never got to launch one. Rich kids, though, they had the whole setup. They would bring them to school science fairs or launch them at the park on weekends with their parents filming from the sidelines. You could hear the countdown and your heart would pound, even if it was not your rocket. It was the kind of moment you would remember for the rest of your life, just watching. The blast-off made you feel like something bigger was always just out of reach. The rest of us just stood back, hoping to feel the whoosh as it lifted off. And when that rocket cracked through the clouds and left a trail of smoke behind, it felt like freedom, like possibility, like everything you wanted but could not quite reach. Jiffy corn muffin mix was once the quiet hero of weeknight dinners. That little blue box with the cartoon corn never changed, and neither did its role. Cheap, easy, and guaranteed to bake into something that felt like comfort. For a while, you could grab a box for under 30 cents, and it would stretch into warm cornbread for the whole family. Add milk, add an egg, stir and bake. It did not get much simpler than that. Now, you pay nearly triple, and it is still the exact same box. The price just grew up without warning. You used to grab 5 boxes without thinking. Now you look at the shelf and wonder if you really need cornbread that bad. It still tastes good, still does the job. But there is something off about paying a premium for what once was a dollar-stretching staple. Families used to use it to bulk out chili nights, turn leftovers into something new, or just make breakfast a little special. It was part of that dependable aisle, the baking row where your cart stayed cheap. Not anymore. Jiffy corn muffin mix is still around, still reliable. But these days, it costs enough that you only buy 1 or 2. And every time you do, it kind of stings a little. Before phones, before messages popped up on screens, there were notes, handwritten, folded into perfect triangles, slipped quietly across desks like tiny sacred secrets. Do you like him? Circle yes or no. Want to hang out after school? You would risk everything to pass one, a teacher's glare, a detention, maybe even getting your note read out loud. But you did it anyway, because you had something to say and no other way to say it. The paper was lined, the ink always smudged. Sometimes the words were crossed out and rewritten 3 times before it felt right. And when someone passed one to you, it meant the world. A joke, a doodle, a question that made your stomach twist. These notes were how teenagers communicated when nobody else was watching. It was raw, personal, real. You kept them in your locker, in your pockets, or folded inside your diary. Some of us still have them, stashed in a box somewhere, yellowed and soft at the edges. A little piece of who we were, passed hand to hand. Generic cola in black and white cans was a true mark of poor shopping trips. The plain white can with blocky black letters simply said COLA and nothing more. It was stacked high in discount aisles, promising a cheaper option than Coca-Cola or Pepsi. Poor families grabbed cases of it, knowing it would never quite taste the same as the real thing. The fizz was weak, the sweetness flat, but it was soda, and that was enough to make kids feel like they were part of the fun. Every once in a while, you got a can that seemed oddly metallic, but nobody poured it out. Parties, cookouts, and family nights featured those plain cans lined up on tables like silent guests. They were stripped of branding and glamour, but they delivered what mattered: a sugary, carbonated drink that felt like a treat. Kids rolled their eyes when friends brought over Pepsi, but at home, generic cola was good enough. To this day, people smile when they remember those plain cans, symbols of thrift and compromise. In the 1970s, your locker was not just where you kept your books, it was your billboard, And if you were a teenager back then, chances are David Cassidy was front and center. Smiling, dreamy, hair feathered to perfection. You might have first seen him on The Partridge Family, but after that it was game over. You were in love. Not in a silly, passing way, but in that deep, unshakable, totally irrational teen kind of love. You tore his picture out of magazines, carefully folded it, taped it up inside your locker next to stickers, notes, and maybe a photo booth strip with your best friend. It was a shrine, a tiny 12-inch wide expression of who you were or who you wanted to be. If someone else had the same poster, it sparked an instant bond. You were part of a secret club that understood what real heartthrob loyalty meant. And if anyone made fun of it, you defended David like he was your actual boyfriend. For those few minutes between classes, opening that locker felt like opening a little window into a better world. A world where your favorite songs played non-stop, where crushes always liked you back, and where David Cassidy was just waiting to notice you. It was harmless. It was obsessive. It was perfect. Looking back, it is easy to laugh. But those little things meant everything. And for some of us, they still do. Frozen mixed vegetables in a brick used to be the most unglamorous thing in the freezer. But it was cheap, it was useful, and it was everywhere. The vegetables were a single frozen block, pressed so tight you had to stab it with a fork to break it apart. Peas, carrots, corn, and green beans all stuck together like they were holding hands. You would steam them with a little butter and salt, throw them into casseroles, or stir them into rice and call it a meal. Back then, that little brick cost under $1, sometimes 50 cents. It was so cheap you never thought twice about tossing one in the cart. Now? That same block of vegetables is nearing $2 in some stores, and it is still the same vegetables, the same mushy texture, the same everything. You are paying more for something that never pretended to be fancy. No new packaging, no added flavor, just more expensive. Even the value brands have crept up to where you start asking if fresh produce is actually cheaper. It is the kind of price hike that sneaks up on you. One day you are stocking your freezer, the next you are standing there doing math over frozen peas. The brick used to be the back pocket side dish of every broke household. Now, it is another reminder that even the humblest foods are not immune. Tapioca pudding mix was weird, lumpy, and kind of magical. You had to cook it on the stovetop, stirring until it thickened, until the little pearls of starch turned from hard beads into soft, chewy bubbles suspended in a sweet, creamy base. It was not instant. It was not quick, but it made the house smell like something was happening. It took time, attention, and a gentle hand at the stove, and that made it feel important. You could eat it warm or cold, with a sprinkle of cinnamon or a dollop of jam if you had it. It was texture more than taste, and once you got used to it, you never forgot it. Some kids loved it, others swore it off forever. But it stuck in your memory either way. The box was cheap, the servings were plenty, and the leftovers, if there were any, tasted even better the next day. Tapioca pudding was the kind of dessert that showed up quietly, without celebration, but gave you the comfort of something homemade when money said otherwise. In the 1970s, this was the pudding that took its time, and reminded you to slow down too. Tapioca pudding mix was weird, lumpy, and kind of magical. You had to cook it on the stovetop, stirring until it thickened, until the little pearls of starch turned from hard beads into soft, chewy bubbles suspended in a sweet, creamy base. It was not instant. It was not quick, but it made the house smell like something was happening. It took time, attention, and a gentle hand at the stove, and that made it feel important. You could eat it warm or cold, with a sprinkle of cinnamon or a dollop of jam if you had it. It was texture more than taste, and once you got used to it, you never forgot it. Some kids loved it, others swore it off forever. But it stuck in your memory either way. The box was cheap, the servings were plenty, and the leftovers, if there were any, tasted even better the next day. Tapioca pudding was the kind of dessert that showed up quietly, without celebration, but gave you the comfort of something homemade when money said otherwise. In the 1970s, this was the pudding that took its time, and reminded you to slow down too. Store-branded ice milk instead of ice cream was the closest poor kids often got to dessert. True ice cream cost more, but ice milk came cheaper, often in large cardboard tubs. It was thinner, less creamy, and melted faster. But to kids, it was heaven. Spoons clinked against bowls as kids piled it high, often doused in chocolate syrup or sprinkles to mask the lack of richness. The flavor sometimes tasted watered down, but when it hit your tongue cold and sweet, you did not care. Families celebrated birthdays and holidays with ice milk, treating it like the finest dessert in the world. It was a compromise, but one that made sense when money was tight. Every poor kid remembered crowding around the freezer, hoping there was still a scoop left in the tub. For many, that ice milk was the taste of childhood. Off-brand cereal in the giant bag was the real trick. You got twice the volume of the name-brand box for half the price, and the taste? Close enough. Whether it was Toasty Oats or Choco Boulders, it poured into the bowl just fine and drowned in milk like the expensive stuff. Now even the giant bags have doubled in price. Some are nearing $7 or $8, and they are still not resealable. It makes you pause. You are paying more, but getting the same stale corners and cardboard crunch if you do not finish it fast enough. Parents used to buy these by the armload. It fed kids for a week. It made mornings easy. But now cereal has become another aisle of sticker shock, and for people who relied on it as a no-fuss meal, that hits harder than spilled milk. It is not just corn and sugar anymore. It is economics in a plastic bag. Shelf-stable pudding cups or mixes were the little reward that did not ask for much. They sat on grocery shelves in rows, plastic cups sealed tight, or powder mixes packed into pouches you could forget about until dessert time rolled around. You didn't need a refrigerator to keep them good. You didn't need fresh milk to make them right, just some warm water and patience. They were the desserts you packed in lunches when real treats were out of reach. Chocolate, vanilla, butterscotch, nothing fancy, but all sweet, smooth, and just enough to feel like you were getting away with something. They made you feel cared for, even when the cupboards were low. A cold pudding cup at the end of a bologna sandwich lunch was the kind of small joy that carried more weight than you realized. You peeled the foil lid slowly, hoping for a clean break, and licked it like it mattered. And it did. Sometimes the mix came in boxes that needed stirring, chilling, waiting. You had to plan ahead, but it was worth it when the pan came out firm and jiggling. Pudding was not about decadence. It was about making the best of what you had and making it feel special. In the 1970s, a pudding cup in your lunchbox or a slice from the fridge meant more than sugar. It meant someone remembered you liked dessert. There was no better place to be than the mall. Not because you needed to buy anything, but because that is where everything happened. It was where you scoped out your crush, split a soft pretzel with your best friend, and maybe begged your parents for a few quarters for the arcade. In the 1970s, suburban malls were exploding in size and popularity, and for teenagers, they were sacred ground. It had everything: food courts with greasy fries, record shops blasting Led Zeppelin, and department stores where you tried on outfits you had no plans to buy. You would walk those shiny tiled floors until your feet ached and still find yourself circling back to the same 2 or 3 stores. Maybe you caught a movie. Maybe you just wandered aimlessly for hours because it felt like freedom. No cell phones, no way to track you. Just you, your friends, and whatever mischief you could dream up between Spencer's Gifts and the escalator. Looking back, it was not about the shopping. It was about feeling grown up in a space that pretended to be the real world. In a decade when teens were starting to find their voice, the mall was where that voice got a little louder. Meatloaf mix packs were one of those grocery store shortcuts that poor families leaned on constantly. They were sold as little envelopes of crumbs and seasoning, promising to help stretch a single pound of ground beef into a full family dinner. Mothers poured the contents into a bowl, added beef, maybe an egg if one was handy, and sometimes even milk or ketchup to bind it all together. The packets all looked the same, no matter what brand you bought, and they usually tasted the same too: salty, savory, and heavy on onion powder. Some moms swore by one mix over another, as if that little paper envelope was a secret family recipe. Kids never realized until later in life that most of the magic in those meatloaves came straight out of a store-brand packet. The seasoning was always salty, with hints of onion and garlic, masking the fact that the real bulk of the meal came from breadcrumbs instead of meat. Kids grew up with dinners where you could count the beef more easily than taste it, but no one complained. It filled plates and bellies. Leftovers were sliced cold the next day into sandwiches, making the mix seem like 2 meals in one. Meatloaf mix made families feel like they were getting creative with dinner, even when it was simply stretching what little they had. In the 1970s, those cheap little packs turned ground beef into survival, and every poor kid remembers them well. So before you go, tell us in the comments which strange 1940s item you'd never dare try, hit like if you enjoyed this trip back in time, and subscribe so you will not miss more forgotten stories from the shelves of history.